Please welcome Grant. Grant Callaghan is a staff security software engineer at Netflix, where he has been working since 2018. His work includes development of tools and services that defend the Netflix platforms, such as design and implementation of authentication platforms and control planes. He has consulted on open source and community projects as Spiffy and Envoy Proxy. Prior to Netflix, he has worked at PDI, Cisco, VMware, Google, as well as a number of R&D startups in Silicon Valley. Please welcome Grant for his talk.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I want to thank the organizers and all the volunteers. This has been a great event so far. I've been really enjoying myself. And thanks for having me have this talk. My name is Grant Callaghan. I'm a member of the Access Control and Engineering team at Netflix in the Information Security Organization. I've been there a little over 5 years, pretty much in the same role. The names of the teams have changed. But we're in charge of providing tools, services, libraries, integrations, architectural review, and advice on corporate and workforce authorization systems. So today I'm going to discuss a couple of the tools and techniques that we use along with various platform teams to scale the adoption, deployment, and operations of zero trust architectural components in a collaborative way that hopefully enables the business while balancing risk and speed. So before we get to the primary programming, I'd like to clarify a few terms that I just used and possibly provide some limits to how this applies across the engineering ecosystem. So I'm going to talk about scaling in a different sense. Zero trust architecture can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Netflix has been around for a while, so what I'm going to talk about is kind of the latest and greatest, but it's kind of an evolving target. So often when we talk about scaling at tech conferences, we're talking about RPS, right? How much traffic can we serve? What I'm going to refer to today is kind of how we scale human operations to avoid imposing too much friction on business efforts. And in terms of zero trust, it can be, co-opted by marketing terms. Even within our teams, we kind of disagree on what exactly it means. In my mind, it's kind of a North Star, what we kind of try to achieve. In this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on kind of the concepts introduced in Google's Beyond Corp and Beyond Prod white papers. So service identities, identity-aware proxies, and similar style architectures. Speaking of proxies, we're going to use them in the traditional sense in terms of like blue coats and API gateways, but we're also going to talk about a little bit in terms of how as security organizations you might be able to leverage other teams to proxy your interests and embed in their business processes. So like I said before, much of this is discussing the latest and greatest that's available to our developers, but in no way encompasses the vast Netflix technical ecosystem. And older legacy applications are migrating at their pace, and that's okay. Changing authorization systems is hard. We've witnessed Google struggle with it. My heart went out when I saw the Meta team struggling with it, and I can't confirm or deny, but you may be looking at an engineer who's responsible for taking down streaming, studio, and corporate all at once. So we like to avoid that. So finally, let's see. I've changed some of the names. You're going to see a lot of logos, which might be different than some of the presentations you've seen before. What I'm hoping to do here is I'm replacing a lot of internal systems that we have with kind of external common off the shelf. Hopefully, if you haven't heard of them, hopefully you'll get introduced to them. If you have, maybe you'll have a better understanding of the types of services and where they stand in this type of architecture. Let's see, and finally, oops. Sorry. So we seek to entertain. Netflix is an entertainment company. This is after lunch. It's Cinco de Mayo. Hopefully, if you're hanging out at B-Sides, much of this might be remedial to you. What I hope is new and maybe brings a smile to your face is I'm going to personify our services. I like a good caper, and so I'm going to do it to the theme of Netflix's Army of Thieves and Army of the Dead. So let's talk about how it started versus how it's going, because there are a lot of scary things to defend out there, but only so much time, energy, and headcount. So it started at Netflix kind of with a program way before my time called LISA, the Location Independent Security Approach. And that's where we really began using identity as the perimeter. This approach leaned heavily on VPN and SSO for a strong network boundary. And this ensured strong authentication for everyone entering the private corporate network. But once you got past that moat, it was pretty wide open, and the permissions were fairly lax. You could get what you needed to get your job done. And at the beginning, with a fairly small, highly technical workforce and a sole streaming product, this made a lot of sense. And it worked. It reduced any risk to the main product or customer joy while allowing us to iterate technically. Unfortunately, made a couple assumptions. One, that this flat network would remain desirable. And two, that services would kind of naturally harden over time to get outside the VPN without a catalyst of sorts. So today we have a network topology that looks something like this. The names and services here have been replaced with different examples. So we don't use all of these, but we definitely use similar in spirit types of services. Many of them didn't necessarily exist when we needed them, so we had to build versions of our own. And the reason we had to do this is because of our evolving workforce. So Netflix is no longer primarily a streaming-only engineering-focused organization. Today we have quite a variety of audiences that interact with Netflix for business processes. Netflix Studios is one of the largest content producers on the planet. Game and animation studios have joined the Netflix ranks, and now live production events. Each one of these audiences has a very different job function, very different job duration, but they all share the need to access a subset of protected corporate resources. So that traditional flat network lacking segmentation and authorization is no longer appropriate for the accelerating business needs and changing risk landscape. So without further ado, let's meet the crew. The cast of characters required to pull off this type of high security caper, implementing zero trust components with leaving as little trace as possible, at least as far as end users are concerned. So today I'm going to give a brief introduction to the gatekeepers sitting on the edge, handling initial requests and interactions, the bouncers checking credentials and directing people where to go, the hideout, where our users and service identities hang out, become known associates, and how they got there in the first place. The bodyguards, security close at hand for any app that needs it. The mastermind, because somebody's got to direct all these divas. The getaway driver for when you need to get from A to B fast. The talent scout, because security is a team sport, so always be recruiting. And the client, because who uses this stuff anyway? So let's start with the front door of the system, API gateways, specifically those that incorporate identity-aware proxies. So this was kind of popularized by Google's Beyond Corp, but there are a lot of different systems that can be set up to kind of be the front door. Systems like Kong, or native cloud services like Kubernetes ingress controllers, or even customized versions of open source services like Netflix's Zool. So these proxies sit on the edge. They're in a highly leveraged position. They provide a singular choke point for external traffic to pass through. When crossing this threshold, requests are inspected for valid credentials. These are often exchanged from external to internal representations. And finally, these requests get routed to internal services to get fulfilled. Additionally, engineers might need to get direct instance access for debugging. So our network uses bastions and jump hosts to protect with an SSH cert authority called BLESS. This allows engineers to go through that protected proxy, centralizing authorization logic and reducing our key material sprawl. So zooming in here on that main diagram we saw, this is where we had an example instance of Kong sitting as an API gateway. So if you show up with the front door without a ticket, our gateways are often going to redirect you here, the bouncer, or in our case, the identity provider. So identity providers and bouncers inspect your credentials closely. Is it valid? Is it username and password or passkey? They can even provide some basic validation on top of the verification. Is the requester of age? Is their ID vertical or horizontal? Is the requester an employee or a contractor? Often identity providers can proxy some of these credential validations behind the scenes, and they can do either full specification compliant redirects to upstream identity providers like G Suite, or either do direct API validation of credentials. This allows you to federate and aggregate various forms of user audiences. So here in that original diagram, if we zoom in, we can see KeyCloak serving that, that use case for us here. So all right, so where do our identities gather? Who do they meet up with? How do they get there? These are the purposes of the various processes that make up the hideout of our principal population. So at Netflix, we're using HR business processes and application registries and a central registries for internal services and authorization systems to reference. So examples of these for other organizations could be Workday or ADP for organization and hierarchy information, combined with something like Spiffy or Spinnaker for application identities. These sources of principals can then be aggregated in a shared grouping service like Active Directory, LDAP, or a custom version whenever our system needs to check a user for their identifying characteristics and known affiliations. So here I have an example logo of Active Directory. Internal, we have a custom built directory. So up close and personal, bodyguards and service mesh operate within intimate trust boundaries. In our topography, we use a customized version of Envoy and an Auth-Z sidecar similar to Open Policy Agent. We call it Gandalf. So these processes can be deployed as sidecars or daemons in the Kubernetes world, or even traditional Linux processes like systemd. On the instance, they can help with things like automatic network operation metadata, like request tracing and metrics, including handling client certificate authentication, OAuth, and pass-based authorization inter-process communication. So this aids in implementing a system very similar to the one described in Google's Beyond Prod, with service-to-service communication protected by service identities and client certificate authentication. So here, when we zoom in, we can see an instance where we have an Envoy sidecar running. We've got the Open Policy Agent running as an authorization system, and we have the application process and possible middleware all interacting. So next, the mastermind, the control plane. So we need to onboard and offboard users and permissions and integrations. So even if you have all of these control points, the API gateway proxying requests at the edge, service mesh protecting every single internal endpoint, unless those are choreographed, the potential can go to waste. So to coordinate all of these moving pieces, you need a player that can see the entire board, a control plane. So we need a way to quickly quick group people when they are hired or change roles. We need workflows to enable and disable these users and permissions depending on the life cycle of the business relationship. And this can be highly variable with those audiences that we just saw. So we also need to integrate with various pieces of our platform to reduce the need for manual configuration that can be done incorrectly. So, and finally, we need to see the difference between plans and reality and make the appropriate changes. When developers are first setting up access permissions, they might not know the ultimate target audience or how the business is going to use their system. Ideally, they can specify a slightly wider net to grant permissions and have this right-sized over time based on observation. So at Netflix, we have systems like RepoKit and Squash SSH to repossess unused permissions and make policy modifications and suggestions automatically over time based on this observed access history. So we've got all these control points. We've got a way to control the enforcement points. But if that's all manual, ClickOps can only get you so far. And even if you have all the configuration and features available, when you really want to step on the gas, you got to meet the developers where they are. So in our case, we've integrated tightly with a number of processes, including continuous deployment. At Netflix, we use Spinnaker and a custom declarative plugin called Managed Delivery. But many other orchestration systems exist, such as Argo CD, Jenkins pipelines, lots of ways to get this done. So there's a lot of data and configuration that can be mined from application manifests. Examples of these manifests appear out in the wild, such as the Open App Model by Kubevela. But when you have these dense delivery specifications, you can extract interesting things like DNS domains that can automatically configure those API gateways and configure automatic OAuth clients with the proper redirect URLs. And when you get this automated enough, you can even get it down to the granularity of tying into pull request review with a federal environment, so UI developers can get a full end-to-end protected zero trust network on every single change. So this has been particularly appealing because our UI developers are easily able to demonstrate their changes in production or in production-like systems, which is much more than static code review can fully portray. So you've got the infrastructure, it's optimized, you've got distributed enforcement points, orchestration, but you still need to win the hearts and minds of your organization. And that's where talent scouts come in. So we need to find new members, new teams to initiate into this yet as unknown and sometimes unproven system. So at the size and scope of Netflix, the engineering organization, and the sheer number of microservices, it would be impossible to accomplish migrations like this manually. So especially if it had to be iterative, if we had to ask for more than one change at a time. So what we've done is we've been embedding code and tools in various scaffolding tools, similar to Yeoman Generator. At Netflix, we call it Newt, the Netflix Workflow Toolkit. So we're also able to do things, this is able to set up a boilerplate with those API gateways for us and all the basics of authentication. Additionally, we're able to team with, pair up with other teams such as the UI team and embed authentication information in UI component libraries. This helps us tightly couple our deployment and identity-aware proxies with our UI and various applications. So you might recognize these libraries as Bootstrap or Material UI. At Netflix, we have an internal component library we call Hawkins. So why do we do all of this? Who uses this, right? So I would say we've got a bunch of end users. Application security has been able to use and leverage a lot of these things. Most notably, when we had Log4j, our API gateway was able to give us a lot of observability, was able to help us block huge classes of attacks while we were able to remediate things on the back end. Incident response is able to look at all of these centralized systems, logs, data, metrics. We're able to do session revocation if necessary. We have probably our biggest end users, aside from end users, are our technical support operations. About 30% of our tickets, or their tickets, tend to be users asking for access to do their job. So at the end of the day, we have a series of systems and teams in place to deploy and manage a fairly complicated topology that gives us a lot of flexibility. So it looks something like this. Again, we don't use most of the logos up here, but we use similar or build similar services and tools ourselves. So most of the teams may understand a small piece and intersection at which their services operate, but really the entire squad needs to work together and perform their role so that we can pull off deploying zero trust components without so much impact. So, all right, thank you very much. That's the presentation. Questions?
All right, we have first question in Slido. How do you determine permission is unused by developers and thus requires reposition? What if I only require access to a particular resource once a year?
So we do have to pick a time frame. So we do have various metrics and observability, but we do have to pick a backtrace time frame and say, hey, is it a year? Is it a year and a half? Like how many? What's the time frame in which we can determine that this has been is stale and we can repossess it? Part of that is also making it easy to regain it just in time in case you do require it again.
Please go ahead, shout it out, and we'll repeat the question.
Hi, thanks, great talk. I was wondering, with doing certificate-based identity, are you doing revocation with that? And did you go with a CRL, or what did you go with if you haven't?
Could you repeat the question for the recording,
yes.
please?
So the question is, with certificate-based identity, are you doing revocation? Did you go with a CRL? How are you doing that? So I believe I'm not sure because that's not exactly my team, so I can't speak definitively to that. So I'd rather not give inaccurate information.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, how do you at Netflix determine whether it's build versus buy?
This is a constant debate. I would say we're often looking. One of the biggest problems is we've run into problems that are larger at scale than the market has solutions for at the time. So we'll often have to build. And then later on, once the market has catch up, we'll look and evaluate regularly to see when it's time to replace and to buy.
Any other questions? Question right, please. Go ahead.
You mentioned 30% of the tickets coming from your support is regarding getting access. Could you throw what is your thought process and how do you evaluate those requests? What are the things that are important to you in doing so?
Yeah, so
Please repeat the question for recording, please.
So the question is, I mentioned that 30% of our tickets were requests for access. So how do we evaluate those requests? So these actually come to our support team. So they're slightly indirect. And so 30% of their tickets are access requests. Generally, there's kind of a decision matrix. Does your team member have this access already? We'll have a list of what we call standard profiles that they can be referenced. Right now, some of it's manual, some of it's automated. We have some specific groups or access policies that are more protected, and they require, so like access to PCI data requires background checks, and those are more enforced. So it depends, but generally there's a business process to evaluate to fairly quickly get the user the access they request, unless there's elevated risk, in which case we take more steps.
We have a question on Slido, a couple of questions. How does the zero trust model work for data use cases, like ML models that aren't microservices?
Yeah, this is a complicated interaction. I will try my best to explain. I don't know it well enough to explain it well, but we have a combination of the service identity and the user identity. And so we kind of, when like a Spark job or a Python notebook runs, it can't run with more permissions than the user running it. So the user running it has to have access to the same underlying data tables. And then there's another permission of, is there does this service application have permission to access that? So we kind of do a matrix of the permissions and combine the identities.
All right. Next question from Slido. What is your process for reevaluating technologies in your stack? How often and with what teams?
I don't think there's an official process. It's generally, I think, pain-based. How much pain are you experiencing running your own identity provider internally? And you compare that with how much pain you can ask your consumers to do to change versus how much pain it's going to be to move on to a different identity provider. And you just have to constantly look and evaluate and use your best judgment.
Right. Next question. ZTA is usually some combo of device, identity, and network. How does the device factor into the security model you've implemented?
So device is definitely kind of further down the maturity model. We're working on that a little bit. Part of the bring your own device makes it a little more difficult. But there are various ways around it. We've done things with Chrome extensions and plugins to interact and make sure that your, we call it stethoscope, make sure that your device is in good health and register it with our fleet. But we also have various different classic systems running inside the ecosystem like Jamf.
Awesome. There are no new questions on Slido. If anybody has a question on the audience, I want to just shout out the question. We still have a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
So you mentioned during your talk that there's some sort of ability you have internally to provision zero trust networks for individual developers on like a PR or something. Is there any additional risk for having that ability to provision an additional infrastructure, or is that mitigated by the fact that zero trust is maintained in that environment?
So what I think
Sorry, I may ask you to repeat the question again.
Thank you. The question, if I can summarize, is there any additional risk with introducing the infrastructure at like the PR or work in progress level and doing that kind of fairly regularly? And I think anecdotally what we've found, and this is kind of that pain-based, we do a lot of our own support. So anecdotally what we found is as much as we can automate, the better. So if you can automate it, you can do it more regularly, but you also reduce misconfigurations. And misconfigurations have been just really the biggest either source of vulnerabilities or source of business friction.
Okay. We have a question on Slido. Have you run into any trouble with architecting this in a hybrid cloud scenario? And were there any challenges setting up this across cloud and on-prem?
That is one of the benefits of working at Netflix is we're pretty much all in on AWS, so we haven't really had to look at hybrid clouds too much. All
right. No new questions on Slido? Anybody? Anybody in the audience has a question? All right. Let's thank Grant once again for his talk.
Thank you.